In the scorching heat of the Kalahari Desert, where temperatures reach deadly highs and water is more precious than gold, a single photograph would shake the world to its core. It wasn't a picture of war, disaster, or human tragedy that would go viral across every social media platform and news channel on Earth. Instead, it was the image of a dying lion, barely breathing, his once magnificent mane now matted with sand and desperation, lying motionless under the unforgiving African sun. This wasn't just any lion. This was Tao, the king of his pride, a magnificent creature who had ruled over 50 square kilometers of African wilderness for nearly a decade. But what happened next would expose a truth so devastating about our planet that governments would be forced to act, celebrities would abandon their luxury lifestyles to join the cause, and ordinary people would fundamentally change how they lived their daily lives. The story begins not with Tao's final moments, but with Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer who had spent 3 years tracking this particular pride. She thought she was simply documenting the natural behavior of lions in their habitat. She had no idea that her camera would capture the moment that would spark the largest environmental movement in human history. What Sarah discovered in that desert would reveal a connection between a dying lion and every single person reading the story. It would expose how our daily choices, thousands of miles away from any African desert, were directly responsible for Tao's fate. And most shocking of all, it would prove that this magnificent creature's death was not an isolated tragedy, but a warning sign of something so catastrophic that scientists initially refused to believe their own data. The world was completely unprepared for what Sarah Chen was about to reveal. Dr. Sarah Chen had been tracking lions in the Kalahari Desert for most of her adult life, but she had never seen anything like what lay before her on that scorching Tuesday morning in March. The temperature was already climbing past 38 degrees Celsius, and it wasn't even noon yet. Her Land Rover had broken down 15 kilometers from her base camp, forcing her to continue on foot with nothing but her camera equipment, 2 liters of water, and her unwavering determination to document the pride she had been following for 3 years. Sarah had first encountered Tao's pride during her doctoral research at Cambridge University. Back then, the pride consisted of 12 members, 3 adult females, Tao as the dominant male, 2 younger males who served as Tao's coalition partners, and 4 cubs of various ages. They controlled a vast territory that stretched across the border between Botswana and South Africa, a region so remote that most humans had never set foot there. Tao himself was a magnificent specimen, weighing nearly 200 kilograms, with a thick, golden mane that commanded respect from every creature in his domain. Sarah had watched him successfully defend his territory against numerous challenges, lead hunting expeditions that fed his entire pride, and sire cubs that would carry on his genetic legacy. He was the definition of wilderness royalty, a creature perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most challenging environments. But as Sarah crested the small sand dune that Tuesday morning, adjusting her telephoto lens to capture what she hoped would be routine behavioral documentation, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Tao lay motionless in the shade of a dying acacia tree, his massive frame reduced to skin and bones, his breathing so shallow that Sarah initially thought he was already dead. She approached carefully, her camera clicking softly as she documented what appeared to be the final moments of a once great king. Tao's eyes, which had once blazed with the fierce intelligence of an apex predator, were now cloudy and unfocused. His ribs protruded sharply through his matted fur, and his massive paws, which had once delivered killing blows to prey animals twice his size, twitched weakly in the sand. As Sarah knelt beside the dying lion, maintaining a respectful distance while capturing image after image, she began to notice details that didn't make sense. This wasn't the natural death of an old lion being replaced by a younger rival. Tao was only 9 years old, still in the prime of his life by lion standards. There were no visible wounds from fights, no signs of disease that typically affected big cats in the wild. More disturbing was the complete absence of his pride. In all her years of studying lion behavior, Sarah had never seen a dying pride leader abandoned by his family. Lions are inherently social creatures, and even when a male is challenged and defeated, the pride typically remains nearby. But Tao lay alone, with no trace of the 11 other lions who had shared his territory for years. Sarah spent the next 6 hours with Tao, documenting his condition and searching the surrounding area for signs of his missing pride. As the afternoon heat became unbearable, she was forced to seek shelter in a small cave formation about 50 meters away, but she kept her telephoto lens trained on the dying lion, capturing his final hours with the dedication that had made her one of Africa's most respected wildlife photographers. It was during those long afternoon hours, as she watched Tao's life slowly ebb away through her camera lens, that Sarah began to notice something even more troubling about the landscape around her. The acacia tree providing Tao's shade was dead, its branches brittle and leafless despite the fact that March should have been the height of the growing season following the rainy period. The grass that should have been green and abundant was brown and sparse, and the small water hole where Tao's pride had regularly come to drink had been completely dry for what appeared to be months. Sarah had been documenting this region for 3 years, but she realized she had been so focused on the lions themselves that she hadn't paid adequate attention to their environment. Now, with nothing to do but wait and observe, she began to see the landscape with new eyes. This wasn't just a temporary dry spell or a natural fluctuation in local weather patterns. The entire ecosystem appeared to be collapsing. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in brilliant oranges and purples, Tao drew his final breath. Sarah captured that moment through her lens, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the end of a magnificent creature who had ruled this wilderness with grace and power. But even as she mourned Tao's death, a growing sense of dread was building in her chest. Something was terribly wrong here. Something far bigger than the death of a single lion. That night, camping alone in the desert beside Tao's body, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. Instead of returning to her base camp and filing a routine report about lion mortality, she would stay in the field and investigate what had happened to Tao's pride and why the entire ecosystem appeared to be failing. She had no idea that her investigation would uncover evidence of environmental destruction so severe that it threatened not just the wildlife of southern Africa, but the stability of weather patterns across the entire planet. She couldn't have imagined that the photographs she had taken that day would eventually be seen by billions of people, or that Tao's death would become the symbol of humanity's last chance to save itself from catastrophe. The next morning, as Sarah began her search for answers, she was simply a grieving scientist trying to understand why one of nature's most powerful predators had died alone and abandoned in the desert. She had no way of knowing that she was about to expose the greatest environmental cover-up in human history, or that powerful corporations and government agencies would soon be trying to silence her forever. But Tao's story was just beginning, and Sarah Chen was about to discover that sometimes the death of a single animal can spark a revolution that changes everything. Sarah's search for Tao's missing pride began at dawn the following day. Armed with her camera, GPS tracking device, and enough supplies for a week-long expedition, she set out to uncover what had happened to the 11 lions who should have been mourning their fallen leader. What she discovered over the next 5 days would shake her understanding of the natural world to its core. Following the faint paw prints and territorial markings that lions leave to communicate with each other, Sarah tracked the pride's movement patterns over the previous month. The trail led her through increasingly barren landscape, past dried riverbeds that should have been flowing with seasonal rains, and through grasslands that had withered to dust despite being only weeks into what should have been the region's most fertile period. On her third day of tracking, Sarah made a discovery that stopped her cold. In a small valley approximately 30 kilometers from where Tao had died, she found the bodies of 3 adult lionesses and 2 cubs. Unlike Tao, who had appeared to die from starvation and dehydration, these lions showed clear signs of poisoning. Their bodies were intact, with no evidence of scavenger activity, which meant they had died recently and that even the desert's cleanup crew of hyenas and vultures was avoiding them. Sarah carefully documented each body, taking photographs and collecting samples of the surrounding soil and vegetation. Her field training had taught her to recognize the signs of various toxins that occasionally affected wildlife, but what she was seeing here didn't match any natural poisoning she had encountered before. The lion symptoms suggested exposure to industrial chemicals, but there were no factories, mines, or chemical facilities anywhere within hundreds of kilometers of this remote location. As she expanded her search pattern, Sarah began to uncover evidence of widespread environmental destruction throughout the region. Water holes that had sustained wildlife for centuries were not just dry but contaminated with a strange, oily film that reflected rainbow colors in the sunlight. Plants that should have been thriving in the post-rain season were dying from the roots up, their leaves yellowed and spotted with what appeared to be chemical burns.
Most disturbing of all, Sarah began to notice the absence of smaller wildlife.
During her previous expeditions to this region, the desert had been alive with the sounds of birds, insects, and small mammals. Now, there was an eerie silence that seemed to stretch for kilometers in every direction. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been poisoned from the ground up. On her 5th day of investigation, Sarah's search led her to a discovery that would change everything. Following the trail of the remaining Pride members, she crested a large sand dune and found herself looking down into a hidden valley that didn't appear on any of her maps. What she saw there made her reach for her camera with shaking hands. Stretched across the valley floor was an enormous industrial facility, complete with massive storage tanks, processing plants, and a network of pipes that extended far into the surrounding desert. Heavy machinery worked around the clock, pumping something from deep underground and processing it through a complex system of refineries and chemical treatment facilities. The entire operation was surrounded by high-security fences and patrolled by armed guards. But this wasn't what shocked Sarah the most. What took her breath away was the realization that waste from this facility was being pumped directly into the underground water systems that fed the entire region. The rainbow-colored contamination she had been seeing in waterholes across hundreds of square kilometers was coming from this single source, poisoning everything downstream and destroying an ecosystem that had thrived for thousands of years. Sarah spent the next several hours documenting the facility from her hidden position on the dune, using her telephoto lens to capture detailed images of the operation. She photographed workers in full protective gear, handling substances so toxic that brief exposure would require hazmat protocols, while those same substances were being dumped directly into the environment that supported thousands of wild animals. As she watched, Sarah began to piece together what had happened to Tao's pride. The lions had been forced to abandon their traditional territory as their water sources became contaminated. Desperate for clean water, they had ventured closer and closer to the industrial facility, eventually drinking from contaminated sources that slowly poisoned them one by one. Tao, as the dominant male, would have been the last to abandon his territory and the last to succumb to the effects of the environmental destruction. But even as she documented this environmental catastrophe, Sarah realized she was witnessing something much larger than local wildlife destruction. The industrial facility was clearly connected to a global network of similar operations, processing resources that were being shipped around the world. The environmental destruction she was witnessing wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of resource extraction that was happening in remote locations across the planet. That evening, camping several kilometers away from the facility to avoid detection, Sarah uploaded her photographs and field notes to a secure server she maintained for her research. She had no way of knowing that her digital trail was already being monitored by security systems operated by some of the world's most powerful corporations. Within hours of her upload, Sarah's satellite phone began receiving threatening messages from unknown numbers. The messages were brief but clear. She was to leave the area immediately and delete all photographs and documentation of her discoveries. If she refused to comply, there would be consequences that would extend far beyond her own safety. Sarah faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could pack up her equipment, return to her university position, and pretend she had never seen the industrial facility that was systematically destroying one of Africa's last pristine wilderness areas. She could publish a sanitized report about lion mortality that mentioned nothing about environmental contamination or industrial activities. Or she could stand up for Tao and his pride, exposing the truth about what was happening in the desert regardless of the personal cost. She could use her platform as a respected scientist to shine a light on environmental destruction that was being hidden from the world through intimidation and corporate power. As Sarah sat alone in the desert that night, looking up at stars that seemed dimmer than they had during her previous expeditions, she thought about Tao's final moments. The great lion had died alone and abandoned, his kingdom poisoned, and his family scattered by forces he could never have understood. But his death didn't have to be meaningless. Sarah made her decision. The next morning she would begin the journey that would expose the greatest environmental scandal of the 21st century, even if it meant risking everything she had worked for throughout her career. Tao's story would be told, and the world would learn what was really happening in the hidden corners of the planet, where corporate profits were more important than the survival of entire ecosystems. She had no idea that within weeks her photographs would be seen by millions of people, or that Tao would become the symbol of a global movement that would challenge some of the most powerful institutions on Earth. All she knew was that a magnificent lion had died unnecessarily, and someone needed to speak for those who had no voice in the corporate boardrooms, where their fate was being decided. Sarah's journey back to civilization took 3 days of careful driving through desert terrain, constantly checking her mirrors for signs of pursuit. The threatening messages on her satellite phone had stopped, but she knew that didn't mean the danger had passed. Corporate interests that were willing to poison an entire ecosystem wouldn't hesitate to silence one inconvenient scientist. Her first stop was the regional office of the Department of Environmental Affairs in Gaborone, Botswana's capital city. Sarah had worked with government officials there before and trusted their commitment to wildlife conservation. What she discovered when she arrived would be the first of many shocking betrayals that would reshape her understanding of how environmental destruction was being systematically covered up. Dr. James Motivational, the regional director who had approved Sarah's research permits, listened politely as she described her discoveries in the desert. She showed him photographs of the dead lions, the contaminated water sources, and the industrial facility that was poisoning the ecosystem. She presented soil samples, water samples, and GPS coordinates that would allow investigators to verify her findings immediately. Dr. McQueen's response was swift and devastating. Within hours of Sarah's presentation, her research permits were revoked, her funding was suspended, and she was informed that her visa to work in Botswana would not be renewed. The official reason given was failure to follow proper research protocols and unauthorized investigation of sensitive areas. But Dr. McQueen's betrayal went deeper than simple bureaucratic punishment. That same afternoon, Sarah received a call from her department head at Cambridge University. Her position was being terminated immediately due to budget constraints and restructuring priorities. Her access to university resources, including her laboratory and research database, was suspended pending a review of her recent work. Sarah realized she was being systematically isolated and silenced by institutions she had trusted throughout her career. The photographs and documentation that could expose the environmental destruction in the Kalahari Desert were being buried under layers of academic and bureaucratic obstruction. Tao's story and the truth about what was happening to wilderness areas around the world was being erased as if it had never existed. But Sarah had learned important lessons during her years of tracking lions in the wild. When facing a more powerful predator, sometimes the only option is to change tactics and find unexpected allies. If traditional academic and government channels were corrupted, she would have to find another way to share Tao's story with the world. Her breakthrough came through an unlikely connection. Dr. Maria Santos, a climate scientist at the University of Sao Paulo, had been following Sarah's research for years and reached out when she heard about the permit revocation. Dr. Cosa Santos had been investigating similar patterns of environmental destruction in the Amazon rainforest, where industrial operations were systematically poisoning indigenous territories while government officials looked the other way. Through Dr. Santos, Sarah was introduced to a network of scientists, journalists, and activists from around the world who had been documenting similar cover-ups in their own regions. Kenji Tanaka from Japan had evidence of massive ocean contamination being hidden by fishing industry officials. Dr. Elena Petrov from Russia had documented the systematic poisoning of Arctic wildlife by mining operations that officially didn't exist. Dr. Michael Thompson from Canada had proof that oil extraction in protected wilderness areas was being covered up through falsified environmental impact reports. What emerged from their collaboration was a picture of environmental destruction so vast and coordinated that it initially seemed impossible to believe. Across 6 continents, industrial operations were systematically destroying the planet's most sensitive ecosystems, while government agencies and academic institutions worked together to suppress any evidence of the damage. The pattern was always the same. Remote locations were chosen specifically because they were far from public scrutiny. Indigenous peoples and local communities were displaced or intimidated into silence. Scientists who discovered the truth were discredited and silenced. And media coverage was controlled through a combination of corporate ownership and legal intimidation. But Tao's story had something that made it different from all the other cases of environmental destruction that the network had documented. Sarah's photographs of the dying lion, taken during his final hours in the desert, captured something universal that transcended scientific data and academic reports. Tao's eyes, clouded with pain but still maintaining the dignity of a creature who had spent his life defending his family, spoke to something fundamental about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Dr. Santos suggested they needed to bypass traditional media channels entirely. Corporate-owned news outlets would never publish stories that threatened their advertisers' interests, and academic journals were too slow and too easily suppressed. Instead, they would use social media to share Tao's story directly with the public, creating a viral movement that would be impossible to contain or control. Sarah was initially reluctant to turn her scientific research into a social media campaign. She had spent her career building credibility through peer review and academic publication, and the idea of sharing her findings through Instagram and Twitter felt like a betrayal of everything she had been trained to value. But as Dr. Santos pointed out, traditional academic channels had already betrayed her by choosing corporate profits over scientific truth. The launch of Tao's story on social media was coordinated carefully across multiple platforms and time zones. Dr. Santos and her network had built relationships with environmental activists, celebrity influencers, and independent journalists around the world who were willing to share content that mainstream media wouldn't touch. They planned a simultaneous release that would make the story impossible to suppress through the usual methods of corporate pressure and legal intimidation. On a Tuesday morning exactly 1 month after Tao's death, Sarah's photograph of the dying lion appeared simultaneously on thousands of social media accounts around the world. The image was accompanied by Sarah's own words, describing her discovery of the industrial facility and the systematic poisoning of the ecosystem that had been Tao's home. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 6 hours, the hashtag #TaoStory was trending globally on Twitter. The photograph had been shared more than 1 million times across all platforms, and news outlets that had initially ignored the story were forced to cover it due to public demand. Celebrity activists, environmental organizations, and ordinary people who were outraged by what they saw began sharing the story with their own audiences, creating a viral wave that no amount of corporate damage control could stop. But the real power of Tao's story wasn't just in the shocking images of environmental destruction. It was in the way Sarah had connected the death of a single lion to the daily choices that people made thousands of miles away. She showed how the industrial facility in the Kalahari Desert was part of a global supply chain that produced materials for electronics, cosmetics, and consumer goods that people used every day without thinking about their environmental impact. Tao's death wasn't just a tragedy happening in a remote corner of Africa. It was the direct result of a global economic system that prioritized corporate profits over environmental sustainability, and every person who participated in that system bore some responsibility for what had happened in the desert. The viral spread of Tao's story marked the beginning of something unprecedented in the history of environmental activism. For the first time, millions of ordinary people around the world had access to uncensored evidence of environmental destruction, and they were angry enough to demand immediate action from their governments and corporations. Sarah had no way of knowing that Tao's story was about to trigger the largest environmental protest movement in human history, or that her simple decision to share a photograph would challenge the fundamental structures of global capitalism. All she knew was that she had finally found a way to honor Tao's memory by ensuring that his death would not be forgotten or covered up by the same forces that had destroyed his home. Within 72 hours of Tao's story going viral, the world began to change in ways that nobody had anticipated. The photograph of the dying lion had touched something deep in the human psyche, triggering an emotional response that transcended political boundaries, cultural differences, and economic interests. But what started as an outpouring of sympathy for a single animal quickly evolved into something far more powerful and transformative. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Amanda Richardson, a former executive at Meridian Industries who had worked on the environmental impact assessments for the Kalahari facility, saw Tao's story on social media and made a decision that would change the course of her life. After 15 years of helping corporations hide environmental damage behind legal loopholes and scientific manipulation, she could no longer remain silent about what she had witnessed. Dr. Richardson's insider knowledge of corporate environmental practices was explosive. She had documentation proving that Meridian Industries, one of the world's largest mining conglomerates, had systematically falsified environmental reports across dozens of operations on 6 continents. The Kalahari facility that had poisoned Tao's territory was just one small part of a global network of extraction operations that were destroying ecosystems while government agencies that were supposed to regulate them looked the other way. More shocking still, Dr. Bick. Richardson revealed that Meridian Industries and similar corporations had developed sophisticated systems for monitoring and suppressing environmental activism. They maintained databases tracking scientists, journalists, and activists who posed threats to their operations, and they had established relationships with academic institutions, media organizations, and government agencies that allowed them to silence inconvenient voices before they could reach the public. Sarah Chen's experience of having her permits revoked and her position terminated wasn't an isolated incident of bureaucratic retaliation. It was part of a carefully coordinated campaign to discredit her findings and prevent the public from learning about the environmental destruction in the Kalahari Desert. Dr. Richardson had been part of the team that planned and executed that campaign, and she provided detailed documentation of exactly how it had worked. The revelation that environmental scientists were being systematically silenced by corporate interests sent shockwaves through academic communities around the world. Hundreds of researchers who had been forced to abandon important environmental studies due to funding cuts, permit revocations, or career sabotage began to speak out about their own experiences. A pattern emerged of systematic suppression that had been happening for decades, hidden behind a facade of academic independence and government oversight. But the corporate response to Tao's viral story was swift and sophisticated. Meridian Industries hired the world's leading crisis management firms to contain the damage to their reputation and stock price. They launched counter-campaigns designed to discredit Sarah's research, questioning her methodology, her motives, and even her mental stability. They flooded social media with manufactured controversy, hiring armies of fake accounts to spread doubt about her findings and redirect public attention toward less threatening environmental issues. The corporate counterattack might have succeeded if not for the unprecedented scale of public engagement that Tao's story had generated. Millions of people around the world had been personally moved by the photograph of the dying lion, and they refused to let the story be buried under corporate propaganda. When Meridian Industries tried to discredit Sarah, ordinary citizens used their own social media accounts to amplify her voice. When corporate-owned news outlets tried to ignore the story, independent journalists and citizen reporters filled the gap with their own investigations. The most powerful response came from an entirely unexpected source. Greta Andersson, a 16-year-old environmental activist from Sweden who had previously focused on climate change, saw Tao's story and made the connection between individual animal suffering and the global environmental crisis. Her response was to organize the largest coordinated environmental protest in human history. Using social media networks that had been built around climate activism, Greta coordinated simultaneous protests in more than 500 cities around the world on a single day that came to be known as Tao Day. The protests weren't just about the specific environmental destruction in the Kalahari Desert, but about the entire system of corporate environmental destruction that Tao's death had come to symbolize. What made Tao Day different from previous environmental protests was the level of personal engagement that people felt with the story. The image of Tao dying alone in the desert had created an emotional connection that abstract discussions of climate change and environmental policy had never achieved. People who had never participated in environmental activism before joined protests because they felt personally responsible for what had happened to the lion and his pride. The protests themselves were remarkable for their diversity and creativity. In New York, protesters created a massive replica of Tao, lying in an artificial desert made from sand, trucked in from Long Island. In London, activists projected the photograph of the dying lion onto government buildings while thousands of people observed moments of silence for the extinct wildlife. In Sao Paulo, protesters dressed as lions and other endangered animals while carrying signs connecting environmental destruction to specific consumer products and corporate practices. But the most powerful aspect of Tao Day was what happened after the protests ended. Instead of simply expressing outrage and then returning to their normal lives, millions of people began making concrete changes to reduce their environmental impact. They researched the supply chains behind the products they purchased, choosing alternatives that didn't contribute to environmental destruction. They divested from companies involved in environmentally destructive practices. They voted for political candidates who committed to genuine environmental protection rather than corporate-friendly greenwashing. IRS was immediate and severe for corporations that depended on environmentally destructive practices. Meridian Industries saw their stock price drop by 40% in a single week as investors fled companies associated with environmental destruction. Consumer goods companies that sourced materials from environmentally destructive operations faced boycotts that forced them to completely restructure their supply chains. More importantly, the political landscape began to shift as politicians realized that environmental protection had become a defining issue for voters across traditional party lines. The emotional power of Tao's story had created a constituency for environmental action that transcended the usual political divisions, forcing even conservative politicians to take environmental concerns seriously. Sarah watched these developments from her temporary base in Sao Paulo, where Dr. Santos had arranged visiting researcher status that allowed her to continue her work without fear of corporate retaliation. She was amazed by how far Tao's story had traveled and how many lives it had touched, but she was also aware that the story was far from over. Corporate interests that had been threatened by the viral spread of Tao's story were regrouping and planning more sophisticated responses. Government agencies that had been complicit in environmental cover-ups were working to restore their credibility while quietly protecting the same corporate interests they had always served. The initial wave of outrage and activism had been powerful, but sustaining long-term environmental change would require building institutions and systems that could resist corporate pressure and government corruption. Sarah realized that Tao's death had given the environmental movement something it had never had before, a story powerful enough to motivate millions of ordinary people to take personal responsibility for environmental protection. But transforming that emotional energy into lasting change would be the real test of whether Tao's sacrifice had been meaningful. The dying lion in the desert had indeed changed everything, but the transformation was just beginning. The final chapter of Tao's story would determine whether his death marked the beginning of genuine environmental reform or simply another cycle of corporate manipulation and public forgetfulness. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her work, documenting corporate environmental destruction around the world, she carried with her the memory of Tao's final moments in the desert. The great lion had died with dignity despite the betrayal of the ecosystem that should have sustained him. Sarah was determined to ensure that his dignity would be honored through the creation of a world where magnificent creatures like Tao could live and die naturally, surrounded by the family and territory they had spent their lives protecting. 2 years after Tao's death, Sarah stood once again in the Kalahari Desert, but the landscape she surveyed bore little resemblance to the poisoned wasteland where she had watched a magnificent lion draw his final breath. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes wondered if she had dreamed the industrial facility, the contaminated water sources, and the systematic environmental destruction that had claimed Tao's pride. The change had begun 6 months after Tao Day, when the sustained public pressure and economic boycotts had forced Meridian Industries into bankruptcy. The company's assets had been seized by an international tribunal established specifically to address corporate environmental crimes, and the proceeds had been used to fund the largest ecosystem restoration project in human history. The Kalahari facility had been completely dismantled, its toxic waste carefully removed and neutralized, and the groundwater system had been purified through an innovative bioremediation process that took more than a year to complete. But the restoration of Tao's territory was only the most visible symbol of changes that had swept across the globe. The viral power of Tao's story had created a new form of environmental activism that combined emotional engagement with sophisticated economic pressure. The Tao Coalition, as the movement had come to be known, had developed techniques for tracking corporate environmental destruction that made it impossible for companies to hide behind legal loopholes and government corruption. Using blockchain technology and satellite monitoring systems, the coalition created a real-time database of environmental destruction that was accessible to consumers, investors, and activists around the world. Every product sold in major markets was tagged with detailed information about its environmental impact, including the conditions in which raw materials were extracted, the energy sources used in manufacturing, and the long-term ecological consequences of disposal. The economic impact had been revolutionary. Companies that continued to engage in environmentally destructive practices found themselves unable to access capital markets as investors fled environmental risks. Consumer boycotts organized through social media could destroy brand values worth billions of dollars within weeks. Political candidates who accepted funding from environmentally destructive industries faced election campaigns where their environmental records became defining issues for voters. Sarah had played a central role in these developments, using her scientific expertise to help design the monitoring systems that made corporate environmental accountability possible. But her most important contribution had been maintaining the emotional connection between environmental activism and Tao's personal story. She traveled constantly, speaking at universities, environmental conferences, and political rallies, always carrying with her the photograph of Tao in his final moments. The image that had started as documentation of a single animal's death had become the most recognizable symbol of environmental activism in the world. It appeared on protest signs, government buildings, and corporate headquarters where demonstrators demanded accountability for environmental destruction. But more importantly, it appeared in homes, schools, and workplaces where ordinary people had hung it as a reminder of their personal responsibility to protect the natural world. The transformation wasn't limited to corporate accountability and consumer activism. The scientific community had undergone its own revolution in response to the revelation of systematic suppression of environmental research. New institutions had been created to provide independent funding for environmental scientists, protected from corporate influence by strict legal safeguards and transparent governance structures. Dr. Richardson, the former Meridian Industries executive who had provided crucial evidence of corporate environmental manipulation, had become the director of the International Institute for Environmental Truth, an organization that investigated and exposed corporate environmental crimes around the world. Under her leadership, teams of scientists, journalists, and legal experts worked together to document environmental destruction before it could be hidden by corporate public relations campaigns. The Institute's first major success had been in the Amazon rainforest, where they exposed a network of mining operations that had been systematically poisoning indigenous territories while government officials accepted bribes to falsify environmental reports. The revelation had led to criminal prosecutions that reached the highest levels of government in 3 South American countries and the mining operations had been shut down permanently. Similar successes followed in the Arctic, where illegal oil extraction operations were exposed and shut down, and in Southeast Asia, where palm oil plantations that had been destroying primary rainforest were forced to restore the ecosystems they had destroyed. The pattern was always the same: rigorous scientific documentation combined with viral social media campaigns that made it impossible for corporate interests to suppress the truth. But the most profound change had been in the way ordinary people thought about their relationship with the natural world. Tao's story had connected individual consumer choices with specific environmental consequences in a way that abstract discussions of climate change had never achieved. People who had never considered the environmental impact of their daily decisions began researching the products they bought, the energy they consumed, and the investments they made. The result was a transformation in global consumption patterns that economists were still struggling to understand. Demand for environmentally sustainable products had exploded, while industries based on environmental destruction had seen their markets collapse almost overnight. The transition hadn't been without economic disruption, but it had also created entirely new industries focused on environmental restoration and sustainable production. Sarah's role in these changes had made her one of the most recognizable environmental scientists in the world. But she had never forgotten that her platform was built on the foundation of Tao's sacrifice. Every speech she gave, every interview she conducted, every scientific paper she published was ultimately a tribute to the magnificent lion who had died alone in the desert because human greed had poisoned his world. Standing in the restored Kalahari landscape, Sarah could see signs of the ecosystem's recovery everywhere. The acacia trees were green and healthy, their branches heavy with leaves and flowers that attracted birds and insects that had disappeared during the years of industrial contamination. The grasslands stretched to the horizon, thick and healthy, supporting herds of antelope and other herbivores that had returned to their traditional territories. Most remarkably, lions had returned to the region. A young pride had established territory near the waterhole, where Tao's pride had once come to drink, and Sarah had been documenting their behavior as part of the ongoing restoration monitoring program. The dominant male was a magnificent specimen, nearly as impressive as Tao had been in his prime, ruling over a territory that had been restored to the pristine condition it had maintained for thousands of years before industrial interests had invaded. Sarah had named the new pride leader Tao Tu, not because she believed in reincarnation, but because she wanted to honor the memory of the lion whose death had triggered the transformation of the landscape. Tao Tu would never know that his territory had once been a poisoned wasteland, or that his right to live and hunt and raise cubs in the Kalahari Desert had been secured by the sacrifice of another lion whose story had changed the world. As Sarah prepared to leave the desert for another research expedition in Madagascar, where the Tao Coalition was investigating illegal mining operations, she felt a profound sense of completion. Tao's story had begun with the death of a magnificent creature in a poisoned landscape, but it would end with the restoration of that landscape and the return of life to places where corporate greed had created biological deserts. The dying lion in the desert had indeed changed everything. But perhaps the most important change was in the way humans understood their relationship with the natural world. Tao's death had taught millions of people that every animal's life was connected to their own choices, and that the health of distant ecosystems was ultimately inseparable from the health of human civilization. Sarah carried that lesson with her as she continued her work documenting environmental destruction and restoration around the world. Tao's sacrifice had given humanity a second chance to create a sustainable relationship with the natural world, and Sarah was determined to ensure that chance wasn't wasted. The magnificent lion who had ruled the Kalahari Desert with dignity and power had found a way to continue protecting his territory even after death, through the millions of people around the world who carried his story in their hearts and expressed their love for him through their commitment to environmental protection. In that sense, Tao had achieved the kind of immortality that legends are made of, becoming not just a symbol of environmental destruction, but a symbol of hope for the possibility of environmental redemption. His legacy lived on in every restored ecosystem, every protected wilderness, and every person who chose environmental responsibility over convenience. The dying lion in the desert had changed everything by proving that even in death, a single animal could inspire humanity to choose life over profit, sustainability over destruction, and hope over despair. Tao's story was complete, but the work he had inspired would continue for generations, carried forward by people who understood that protecting the natural world was ultimately about protecting the dignity and beauty that Tao had embodied in his final moments under the desert sun.